Ready. Play.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whatever time it is in the world, wherever you are tuning in from, where Raj is from, or where he's living or currently residing, I should say. It's very early in the morning. It's about just gone 7:30, am I right?
Correct.
But you're bright and breezy and ready to talk about Rafa Nadal and his current travails, but also one or two from the past. But before we do that, Raj, can you just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about you?
Sure. Yeah. So my background is, I'm a doctor of physical therapy, but I have a huge sports background. So I work with a lot of high level clients, individual players, whether it's, from rehab all the way to the performance side. So it's never too early to talk tennis, in my opinion. So here I am.
Great. And if any of us, including me anyway, follow you on Twitter, we're very aware of your passion for sports across the board. I'm a big football fan, or soccer, as perhaps people in North America are familiar. So I'm frequently seeing you giving us updates on injuries and suggestions and your thoughts on those. But we're here, as you said, to talk tennis and more specifically injuries. And with Rafa Nadal in particular, I'd like to talk about the present and even immediate future. If we have a rough timeline on the latest injury, if you like, because I think that's where we should certainly begin, and maybe have made most of our focus on, because this could be the one that finally curtails his career. In Australia, he has what appears to be a stumble as he's stretching, I think, on the forehand side, and falls. Now, whether it's the impact or the stretch or a bit of both that caused this psoas or hip injury, I don't know specifically. Maybe you could flesh that out for us, Raj, in a second. But also, he did touch on the fact that it was something that had first flared up in the day or two before in practice and had clearly been exacerbated. As somebody who's watched Rafa Nadal pretty much constantly for the last 20 years, as soon as he has a fall of any kind, you're kind of thinking, oh, and I was watching his movement for the next couple of points, and I was like, okay, this is terminal for today, one way or another, and that's what happened. We then got a prognosis for 6 to 8 weeks, which of course has been very, very different. Raj, can you react to some of the things I've just been talking about?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to start with how the injury happened, right? I think you made the point where he said that he was feeling it for a few days prior. So typically what happens is that, that last stretch on the forehand or fall, whatever it is, that's just the last straw that broke the camel's back.
Okay.
It's something that's been building up over time. And so, the way I try to describe it is like, imagine you have a bucket that's getting filled with water. Eventually it overflows. The last drop isn't the reason, it's everything that came before it, right? And I think in Rafa's case, that's what happened. And that speaks to your point that he was probably feeling, he might even have, been feeling it prior to that, but he just never didn't, put it in his head, right? Because, you're an elite athlete, they all have nicks and knacks here and there. Some days you'll have it, next day it'll go away. So it's probably something that's just been building up over time. And then, so then when that happened, obviously it impacted him. If I remember correctly, he had to change his serve. He couldn't go as overhead, right? And so just the injury itself is, the psoas, it's a combined muscle that kind of runs down the front of your hip. I know the hip, you say hip injury, it's very, ambiguous and nebulous.
Yeah.
But the iliopsoas specifically kind of runs down the front of your hip. It's actually two different muscles, iliacus and the psoas. And so, based on that early timeline, kind of sounded like a grade 2 moderate tear, but timelines aren't definitive. You don't really know how long a player might take good, less time or more time until you really start getting into rehab and going through some of those progressions and, start testing their strength, testing their mobility, testing their sport specific actions. And that's what really dictates a timeline. So personally, I don't really put that much of a emphasis on timelines, but the fact that it's almost been double what they said, that is now certainly concerning, right? I think even Rafa had some consternation about that in some of his quotes about,
Yes.
well, clearly, yeah, it's been 14 weeks and it's not getting better. So,
Yeah, he's obviously frustrated. What do you think is surgery an option, by the way? Because he's now talking about having a minimum 6 week break from just returning to the court. We'll talk about the broader implications at some point as well, but let's just talk about the immediate implications. He said he doesn't know when he's going to return to the court. We've seen some discomfort from him a little bit during his practices in the build up to the French Open. Did you suspect all along that it was going to be a long shot, or it just wasn't likely that he would participate in Paris?
yeah, I mean, that was one to me. Obviously, Roland Garros for him is one of his best tournaments. He loves to be there, so I thought he might try to ramp up and see how it affected him. Considering he hasn't played much, I always thought it was going to be a very much a long shot for him to do that. And of course, coming off this hiatus, and then trying to play high level tennis, that's just opens yourself up for more injury risk, right? So, knowing Rafa, he's always going to try, but it sounds like, there were no indicators there. Let's say the trend line there was not positive, right? He was not reacting well to increasing his activity intensity. And therefore, at that point, you have to take that. You have to kind of, if it's not working, you got to reassess your plan and then get a new plan.
Are you familiar with other sports people having this injury, or does it tend to occur more in certain sports than others?
So as honestly, a lot of times, most like pro teams won't even release a deep. They'll just say hip injury. So
Okay.
from prevalence wise, I know it's very common in football, just because the taking mechanism with the hip, right, can be lead to overload. Soccer can lead to a lot of overload there, and so, but in general, it's just a tough one because it's so involved with every movement, and then with tennis also, people think hip, but it's not just it's a hip flexor. So it brings your knee up towards you, but it also, when you rotate or you bend your trunk forward, it's involved in that as well. And so obviously tennis involves a lot more trunk action than many other sports, right? So now you have a double demand on that muscle. You add in Rafa's playing style, which tends to put him in some precarious positions. And so then you add in, I mean, 20 plus years of just wear on his body. You add in his previous injury history. We know he's been playing through a lot throughout his career. We know recently with all the issues, right? And that's going to oftentimes lead to change demands that you can't really prognosticate throughout your body.
Is age and 20 years on the tour a key factor in this particular injury?
I mean, yeah, I hate to always just say, oh, age is age, because he's done such a great job of it. But at some point, there's just so much wear on your body from these years and years that it definitely has to be a factor. And then I think it's even more of a factor in Rafa's case because we know what his playing style was like, right? He's changed it a little bit to be more aggressive and limit points. But for how many years he was that guy, right? Who's 2 feet behind the baseline and just trying to, grind it out. And eventually that's going to catch up to you. Doesn't matter how well you take care of yourself. I think Rafa even being here at this point is a testament to how well he's taking care of himself. But there still does come that end point. Like we saw it with Federer too, who's incredible with his nutrition, and he never had that grinded playing style like Rafa did. But at some point, there does come a time where in a sport where the margins are minuscule, right? Like elite tennis, there comes a time where you just don't got it anymore, or you don't have it to the level that you want it.
What are the options on the table right now for Rafa? And is one of them surgery?
It's typically surgery, like in muscular issues, would be like if there's, let's say, like a ruptured muscle, like Rupture typically occurs at the end of the muscle where it's a tendon. So typically there typically aren't surgical options. Typically, if it's not responding well, it's more conservative than surgical. There are potentially some options, like let's say if he wants to use like injections or PRP to try and re-stimulate that healing process, and we've seen with Rafa that he'll go to any lengths to try and do it. But surgery here doesn't really seem plausible. But again, I don't know the full injury extent, right? It's still iliopsoas itself still can have a lot of variance in terms of where the injury specifically occurred along the muscle, and so that's hard to really determine.
What are your broader thoughts on say this 6 week or potentially 6 month? I mean, what are your thoughts? Do you think this is, when you probably heard some of the words he said last week in the press conference, and clearly his discomfort? I'm aware of the fact that he's barely been serving this year. So we've had serving issues before over the last 12 months of Rafa with rib and abdominal issues. And with that, when you're watching, you're going, yep, that makes sense. That's a part of the body we can see directly being put under strain. And yet now, probably for casual observers, especially not medical experts, they're going, but this is a hip injury. How's that related to the service motion?
Yeah, so kind of like how I mentioned before, right? The iliopsoas still is involved with the trunk. It's involved with trunk action. So when you go up to serve and now you're extending and rotating, the iliopsoas takes on load during that motion. And then when you come forward and you're rotating and flexing, bending, the iliopsoas again takes on action, right? And so most people, I think, will think like hip, like the outer hip or the back of the hip, like the glutes. But the iliopsoas literally runs right down the front, almost like almost inner thigh area. And so it's highly involved in serving. And I believe it's all left side related too, if I remember correctly, the injury.
Yeah, quite possibly. What I'm aware of is that serving has been an issue, and of course he's a left-hander. But also I think it's at this time of year, well, I guess all times of year in tennis, but this time of year, of course, we're in the clay court season and therefore sliding on both sides. But I'm aware of the fact that he's having difficulty moving on the backhand side. We've seen clips of him hitting forehands and backhands, but not with movement, if that makes sense. And of course, in a tennis match, you're stretching and you're moving on both sides. And he's definitely the best of all time on this surface in terms of movement and pretty much everything else. So he's clearly thought to himself as well. And we spoke about the likelihood of him potentially playing this French Open. Perhaps 10 years ago, given the gap between him and his competitors, maybe he could go in with 1 or 2 issues and get away with it, because 80% Rafa would be good enough to win the French Open. Now, with Carlos Alcaraz, Djokovic being more competitive on this surface than ever, and also Holger Rune, and who knows, even Daniel Medvedev, there's just too many competitors that there's just, I don't think as mentally as well that he wanted to go into Roland Garros, play 2 rounds, wave to the crowd and go home. He's someone who's won 14 of these as well. Listen, talking of mental side of it, unless you want to react to something I've said, Raj.
Well, I just want to say, I mean, I think everything you said right there is summed up by risk reward, right? The risk is not worth the reward for him at the moment. And so that's really all it comes down to. And that might come down to other factors as well, right? Like I think he knows he's a new dad. If he gets severely injured, right, it's going to affect him off the court too. So there's a lot of things that now come into play for him when it comes to those risk factors. He also knows if he does go in and get injured, he might not based on his recovery with this injury. If he does go in and get re-injured or some other injury, right, that might be a career ender for him now, right?
Yeah.
So is that risk worth it for him? It doesn't sound like, it is right now. And that's kind of probably why they pulled back.
It does feel like as well, it's also an accumulation of the injuries over the last 20 years, perhaps even more specifically the last 3 years. He talked about the pandemic being a turning point as a mark in the sand rather than the pandemic itself, but just the last 3 years. And we know about the foot issue. I know that you've spoken at length as well, Raj, in the past about that. If you could just, talk about the foot injury and your thoughts on the ablation, for example, which does apparently, of all the issues, it does seem to have had a lot of success for him, since he had that just over a year or just under a year ago.
Yeah, so he has a condition with his foot. I cannot remember off the top of my head what it is.
Mullivice.
Okay, yeah. So essentially, it's a chronic condition. It's nothing you can really do about it, but it leads to a lot of pain kind of in the arch of your foot. So an RF ablation, radio frequency ablation, is they just targeted the nerve that generates that pain, or that, because nerves are what trigger pain. So they just targeted that nerve and they ablate it, meaning they kind of like almost like deaden it. So that's kind of what he did. And it makes sense, the fact that they were able to do it. If you're able to specifically target that nerve and it works, it makes sense. The risk is always like, I think he talked about this, right? He couldn't really feel his foot. And so,
yeah, during the French Open.
Yeah. So that was kind of pretty, incredible. But also speaks to it, how much his feel on, clay courts is incredible, right? Where he doesn't have to even feel his foot to really be that good on that. For him, I think probably do it eyes closed, right? He's so good at it. But yeah, that seems to be kind of addressed. But I think what I touched on, what you touched on, is that who knows what him playing through that injury and that pain might have led to in the rest of his body, right? Whether it was an injury at that point or some start of overload or compensation that then down the line leads to another injury, whether it was this psoas or not.
Returning to the psoas, is it a career-ending injury generally? When as I say, when it first flared up, it's like, a bit of a telling point for me though. Looking back, it probably didn't tell me much at the time, but his wife crying with this particular injury when it happened, and he basically limps off, the court. He does finish the match. I don't know whether that had any effect in terms of the length of, him playing for another 45 minutes. Having clearly exacerbated the problem. He wasn't moving very well. The thing is, in tennis with an injury, you can just hit a winner. In football, you've got to come off. In fact, 99% of sports, you just got to come off. In tennis, you might get away with it, at least that day. And of course, you don't know. Maybe in 2 days, you have no idea as a player what the prognosis might be. We saw him, by the way, do something very similar, albeit with a different injury, against Taylor Fritz in the quarterfinals last year when he had an ab injury. It wasn't till he had the prognosis after the match that he realized this is going to also put him out for 6 weeks or so. But yes, a telling sign was his wife was tearful. And I'm thinking that's an unusual reaction for what, could well be a 6-week injury more than anything else. And it was probably a sign that the family and Rafa himself have gone through this for years now. And he also mentioned it in his press conference last week now, that it's just one injury after another. It's not like, it's this injury and then it gets fixed and whatever, but it's just constant. His uncle, I actually interviewed his uncle face to face in Mallorca a few weeks ago. And he said as well that last summer, from that moment, the body went down, were his words. In other words, it wasn't just the abs or the ribs or laterally the hip. It was just the body went down, and there was no reward as well, because he was losing tennis matches at the end of last year and then also at the beginning of this. Talk to me about the mental toll you think that could well have had.
Yeah, I think it's massive. And I think, her crying speaks to that mental toll. It's just, you're constantly grinding and trying to get out of it. But it becomes this cycle of injuries because you get injured. Of course, that leads to re-injury risk in that specific area. But now your fitness level drops, right? So now you're trying to build up fitness again. And you can't, no matter what you do off the court, you can never rebuild true fitness until you're playing in games. You just can't replicate it. There's too many. Anyone who's played knows it. You can't replicate that level of fitness, the adrenaline in a game that you can't replicate that. So you have to be able to then play consistently in matches to rebuild your fitness and eliminate some of those injury risks. Rafa has gotten in this constant cycle, right? Injury, tries to come back, gets hurt, fitness drops, gets hurt, fitness constantly dropping, body going down, right? So, we see it in a lot of other sports as well. It's this injury, re-injury cycle. and it's very, very difficult to get out of it. The problem in those sports, it's still a team sport, so you have other players who can play. In an individual sport, obviously, there's no reprieve, right? So that's the really really difficult part when it comes to individual sports. Oh, for better or for worse, it's all on you. And I think with her crying, I think Rafa's a smart guy. His team's smart. They're starting to see the signs are there, right? He understands. I'm sure he feels it every day. Like, hey, I don't feel like I used to. I'm not recovering like I used to. And I'm sure his wife, knows those things as well, right? He's talking to her about those things. And I think it was just probably part of that. Part of it's frustration, seeing how hard he works to try and get back out there and not having it come off. So, yeah, it's just a combination of all those factors coming into play.
Have you dealt specifically with anyone with this injury that Rafa's got right now with the psoas?
Yeah, multiple. It can be a tough one to deal with just because of how intricately it's involved in movement.
And what are what tends to be, have you seen situations with sports people or people who are playing regular sports at all levels where they after 6 weeks, for example, they do return to their sport and then they break down, they return, they break down, and then they just go, that's the end of the road for me?
Yeah, I've seen it in multiple instances, whether it's, it's an injury there or really any substantial muscular injury where they just can't recover from it. There's always that risk, right? And so have certainly seen it. I don't know specifically with the psoas, but it wouldn't surprise me, it's still the same kind of principle of it. You have a highly involved, high load muscle that gets damaged, and you just can't get over it. And you, especially at the level that he's trying to play at, right? Like, you're pushing your body to the limits, and his margins have just decreased significantly. So it's something that it's just part of elite sport, unfortunately.
What is, as we sort of bring this to a close, Raj, what is your thought? I mean, you're a sports fan as well as a medical expert, but what is your thoughts on having seen the situation with Rafa since January, having heard what he said last week, where he said he just doesn't know, it could be 6 weeks, it could be 6 months before he returns to the practice court, and even then, if he feels similar discomfort again, it may be a farewell tour, if you like, or, he could return to the practice court in a couple of months from now, feel good, and start playing competitively again, and maybe have a healthy 6 or 12 months in which to also not just do a farewell tour, but a successful period of his career, if you like, a tournament win,
Right.
getting to finals and this kind of thing. What's your feeling of all those sort of 2 or 3 possibilities? What do you think is the most likely outcome?
Man, it's so hard. Honestly, I wish I could say. It's so hard to say in this instance because, like we're finding out with the original timeline, you don't know how he's going to respond to these things. So all I can say is I think his plan of care makes sense where he hasn't responded well. So you have to give yourself more time to be able, whether that's sacrificing this season, whatever it is, right? You have to give yourself more time to be able to ramp up. That still doesn't guarantee anything, and that's
what would he have been doing during that 6 to 8 week period where he wasn't on the practice court? So the injury happens, it gets diagnosed.
yeah.
What would have occurred in that 6 to 8 weeks? Would there have been some things going on rather than just complete rest?
Oh yeah, absolutely, completely. They might rest until like we call it the acute, the short term phase until that injury has died down. But then you're getting right back into treatment. You're getting right back into progressive, starting low level strengthening, low level mobility work, and then you're just building that up into eventually more sport specific demands, right? And so I think my guess is he's just going to try. They're going to dial it back down again and then build it up again conservatively. That's why he's taking that time.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes it always doesn't work out that first time. So like I said, it's so hard to prognosticate that far out, especially with a player like him who obviously hasn't recovered well from this injury, has a huge injury history. There might be a lot of other factors we just don't know about, right? There's so many individual variables that come into play, that we just don't know about. And so, I mean, all I can say is I think his Planetaire makes sense. I truly hope, of course, that he's able to come back and be competitive. And because I think he honestly, I hate to say the word deserve, but I think he deserves that for how
Yeah.
much he's given to the sport and how hard he works. I mean, he's part of what got me into tennis, just, from a personal standpoint. I think that probably speaks to a lot of our generation, right? With him, Fed, Joko, just the level of tennis that was played. So from that standpoint, I certainly hope so. But I think all we can really do is focus on that day to day, and we gotta just see how he responds. It's not, it's not a comfortable answer, but that's just what it is. That's oftentimes what it is with rehab. There's no certainty either way.
Although his age, he's about to turn 37. In that respect, time isn't on his side. But I think from what he said last week, there isn't the pressure now of going, I've got Roland Garros on the horizon. This is what my best tournament. That is not now on the horizon. So I think he can be as conservative as he wants and needs to be, and maybe just doesn't take any risk at all. There's no championship or tournament that he has to be back for. So, as he said, it could be 6 weeks or 6 months before I'm on a practice court, and just take all the time. And probably, Raj, from what I understand and from what you've said today as well, just doesn't know until that day that, because you and I have probably had niggles and injuries and we think we're okay, but we don't know until we go for that run or we kick the football. And
Exactly.
he won't know until he stretches for that ball 6 weeks or 6 months from now, until then. And even then you start, I mean, the brain starts to feel things as well. Did I feel a twinge in my hip then, or is that me imagining things? And
Right.
maybe you even hope you didn't. These kind of mental things as well are going on, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, mental confidence, what we call kinesiophobia, fear of movement or re-injury, kicks in for sure, especially with
Yeah.
long-term injuries, especially with injuries that you've kind of had a re-injury with, right? So you start questioning yourself. I think even if you do get over the injury, you start questioning yourself at times. And so when tennis already makes you question yourself, and you have this, right? It's even more difficult. And so, yeah, the mental component is massive. And so I think, obviously we know Rafa, his mental fortitude is one of his strengths throughout his career, but he's never faced anything kind of having to really look and see the end of his career with injury. It's quite difficult. I think we saw this also with Fed to an extent. He tried to take a season off, right, and then come
Yeah.
back. When he ramped up, the U.S. Open, he was trying. He kind of just said, "I can't do it." Or was it Wimbledon or U.S.? I think it was U.S. Open. I can't
I
remember.
mean, he had a couple of moments, but one was in the US in 2019. But then, of course, he comes back about. Well, I always feel, Raj, when you're away, like Federer was, for example, for pretty much 18 months.
Yeah,
There's a feel. I mean, I saw it with footballers such as Owen Hargreaves with tendonitis, knee tendonitis, which, by the way, Rafa's had on and off in his career as well. And tendonitis is something that, of course, can affect various other joints as well. But when you see a sports person not play a competitive match for when it gets beyond a year, for me, alarm bells are ringing. And I think Federer went something like, almost, or certainly beyond 18 months without playing. He then plays the French Open, and then he plays Wimbledon, but he's a bit of a shadow of himself. And in 2021, latterly, he talked about the fact that he could feel the knee during that tournament at Wimbledon in 2021. And people have drawn parallels with Rafa, because he's played about 6 or 7 matches in the last 8 or 9 months. And it's probably almost a year since we would say we've seen a healthy Rafa, albeit we've seen him intermittently. And now, of course, if he doesn't play a match again this year, which is possible, then we will be looking at that 12-month period. And yeah, so there's been parallels between them, not just in the way they've played their careers, but also the way that they potentially might finish them.
Yeah, exactly. And so we'll see. And that's the hardest thing. I think it's just one of those things with whether it's Fed or Rafa. I mean, they want to go out on a high note, so you try to do everything you can. That's all you can do. It doesn't guarantee the outcome. Just like tennis, you can play your best match, and Djokovic can hit a return, and ace you,
Yeah.
and so it doesn't guarantee anything. But all you can do is have the right plan and give yourself the best chance. I think they've done that throughout their career. And I think we're going to see that on the tail end. Obviously, we saw it with Federer, didn't work out, and we'll see how it goes with Rafa here.
Yeah, and as you said, it's possible. It's possible that there's sort of 2 or 3 scenarios, and one of those scenarios for the optimists out there is that we do see a competitive Rafa for one more stretch of time.
Yeah, certainly possible. And if anyone can do it, it's Rafa, and he's proven that time and time again. So, like I said, I think we're all rooting for him. We all want to see that. So I would just keep an eye on kind of how he's progressing. Same things you talked about earlier, how he's doing in practice, if he's able to progress, move out of those just controlled forehand hitting, if he's able to hit more on the run, right, and really test himself. That'll be more objective signs of how he's progressing.
When you start seeing him, serving and moving and playing practice points against opponents, and as you say, stretching and moving across side to side, and if he's doing that in no discomfort, then we can grab hold of that and go, I think there's a tournament on the horizon. Raj, listen, before I let you go, I think that's your Twitter handle there below. So make sure you give Raj a follow on Twitter. But I think you've got other social media things and stuff going on as well, right?
Yeah, so same handle on YouTube as well, my website as well. So yeah.
Make sure you give Raj a follow on all the social media, but also check out his YouTube channel where you can also keep up to date with all things physical, particularly on the sporting side. Big thanks to you, Raj. I know it's pretty early in the morning where you are right now in California, right?
Yeah, I'm in LA, so
yeah,
almost 8, but yeah.
Yeah.
Good way to start the day.
Have a good day. I don't know if you'll be treating various people with psoas injuries or sports people anyway. But also I'm sure you'll be sharing your thoughts on various sporting injuries on social media in the coming days and weeks. So big thanks from Talking Tennis for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell so you don't miss out on all things tennis.